Hey, what's up? Today we're making a popper fishing lure. I'm going to do this video kind of more or less for beginners. I'm by no means a professional, but this is just how I do it and kind of how I started off. So if there's any of you guys that are professionals or you've had a lot more experience than I have, drop a comment below if there's anything I'm doing that's wrong or a way that we could help other people trying to learn how to make lures. So let's roll the intro and hop right into it. So to get things started, I always like for the poppers to start off with a dowel rod. You've already got the round mouth going on, and that works out great. And this wood that I love using is poplar. It's super easy to carve, and it's got a really tight grain pattern. Now, if you're starting off, any wood floats. So as long as it floats, then you've got a fishing lure. I would recommend not using a hardwood right off the bat, just because it's so hard. It's going to be a little bit harder to carve, and they are a lot heavier. Doesn't mean it's not going to float and wouldn't work, but if you're starting off, and this is what I use for all of them, is poplar. Super easy, it's lightweight, easy to carve, but it's got that really tight grain pattern, so when you're carving into it or drilling your holes, it's not going to split or crack as easy. First thing we're going to do is cut this to length, and I'm probably going to do a 3 or 4 inch popper, and then we'll sand both ends to kind of give it a nice smooth surface, because right now it's got that like the cut from the saw on there. Alright, I'm using my vise. If you don't have one, it's no big deal. In any form that you have of cutting, do it. So I'm going to start cutting right in here. Have a nice long big popper. Okay, so see how the end of this is all torn up? What I'm going to do is hit it on the belt sander really fast to clean that up. So whenever we carve the mouth out on the popper, it won't have all that loose grain and saw marks on there. And also, if you don't have a belt sander, it's okay. Just hand sand it. There we go, now both ends are very smooth. Okay, now we're going to start the process of carving out the mouth a little bit. And what I like to use is a Forstner bit. Now, if you don't have one, it's no big deal. You can use a Dremel tool, or you can even use normal drill bits and keep stepping it up until you get some of it knocked out. And I'm just doing this solely for the fact that it makes quicker work. It carves out a bulk of that material and makes less work later down the road when I'm using the Dremel tool. I'm going in about a 1/4 inch. I went in pretty far because we're going to carve a lot of this lip back at an angle later. So most of that's going to go away, but that's just our starting point. So normally this is the part where I'd mark out where my eyes are and go ahead and drill those out. That way when I go to sand the body down, I don't sand too far on the eyes. But since I'm going to be hand painting this one without an airbrush, I'm not going to be putting the normal eyes in there. I'm going to paint the eyes on. But here's how I make my stencils. I take a piece of paper, wrap it around until it basically fits the size of the dowel rod, cut it. It's not a perfect cut, but the idea is that you get it pretty close to both sides there. So then what I do is I fold it in half, and I fold it in half again, and that crease gives us the center line. So I'd want my eye just above the center line, and I drew on my gill plate. So I'm going to go ahead and use a little X-Acto knife and carve out where the gill plates are going. That way we can mark it out, so when we go to sand down the body to the shape that we want, we don't sand too much down to where there's no room to carve the gill plates in later. And of course you can skip this step if you want. You don't have to do this. This is just what I like to do. Alright, so all I'm doing is just marking it out, like I said, so when we go to sand this down, we don't go too far where there's not enough room to carve the stuff. And then we'll be painting the eyes on, so I'm not going to worry about marking those right now. Okay, there we go. So now we got a left side and a right side, and this is going to be the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and do myself a quick favor and put a B for bottom, just because I want the gill plate to be lower on the bottom. So now we're going to go ahead and start sanding. Okay, so there's a number of ways that you can carve this down. And it's basically whichever way is easiest for you, or whatever tools you have access to. So you can use a file like this one. I recommend putting in a vise or having some way to clamp it. File it down. You can use a carving knife and carve it down. I mean, whatever way you can do, you can chew it down if you want. I don't care. There's not really a right or wrong way to do it. The way I like to do it, just because it saves a lot of time, is using the belt sander. So if you have one of those handy, perfect. If you don't, use what you got available. If it's just a carving knife, a rasp, or a file, and I'm sure there's a long list of other things you can do. Or if you have a lathe, that would be a good way for a popper too. But like I said, what I'm going to do for this video is just use my little belt sander and go from there. Alright, so what I'm going to do is just start by rounding this bottom corner out, because here's our mouth up front. I'm going to start by rounding this backside down to about the thickness that I want it to be. Now I'm going to start taking some off the sides, and keeping in mind where, I don't know if you can see it or not, the line for the gill plate is. I'm going to go up a little bit past that, but not too far, because I want a lot of meat to stay up there since we're going to be hollowing out this mouth quite a bit. But I'm going to start by taking some off the one side, taking some off the other, so I can establish which side is my left and right, and then we're going to go from there. So there you can see we've rounded the back side of it down, and then I've got one side where it's a little bit flat and the other side flat as well. And so what I'm going to do now is start carving up. That way we kind of have that raindrop shape going on. That way it's not just a straight dowel rod. So I'm going to start taking off some of this material right here, and then same thing along the top too. Take some of that material down so we get that nice raindrop shape going on. There you go. So now you kind of get the idea of what's going on here. So now we're going to run back over to the vise. We're going to stick it back in the vise and sand these corners all flat to each other. So it really would be easy to do this with a rasp or even a X-Acto knife, just carving parts flat. And if you start off with a square piece of wood, then it's the same thing. And once you get it where you're going to start shaping it to your final size, what I like to do is use a piece of leather inside my vise, so that way I don't crush all this hard work I've done. And you can even do this from the start too. If you have a vise, all I'm using is a piece of 100 grit sandpaper, and this one's actually been worn quite a bit, so I might get a new one if this isn't doing the trick for me. But I'm just going to go back and forth, and what's going to do is be taking off the even amount on both sides, as long as I'm keeping my pressure in the same spot. So I'm actually going to move this out just a little bit more. Okay, so I did switch sandpaper because the other one was pretty worn out. So this back end is a little bit thicker than I wanted, so I'm just going to knock a little bit more material off on the belt sander real quickly. There we go. So I just knocked a little bit more off, and I'm going to go back to hand sanding. Alright, so now we've got the basic shape of this carved out, and what I'm going to do, this is an older popper I made a long time ago, is I'm going to sand the lip of this to match kind of like how this one is. Okay, so like you can see on this one, the mouth is at a little bit of an angle. We're going to do the same thing on this one. So again, whatever you have available to do that with, rasp, whatever, it's going to work, or you can just put a piece of sandpaper down on the table and sand it at an angle like that too. Now what this does is, it, just in my experience, having this at a little bit of an angle helps catch that water and make the pop sound, or at least splashes the water. Or if it's straight like this and barely sitting down in the water, it's going to have a little bit of trouble getting the water up in there to make the pop sound. So we're just going to knock it back a little bit, just like this one on the belt sander, and then we will be ready to start carving stuff. Alright, so now we got that mouth going at the angle that we want, and I think this bad boy is ready for some nice final hand sanding, and then we will whip out the X-Acto knife and start carving it. I'm just going to speed it up because it's nothing really that exciting to see as far as the hand sanding goes. So you should have something that looks similar to this. If it doesn't look like this, that's okay. We are ready to start carving the gills in. You can do a ton of carving. For our purposes on this video, we're trying to keep it simple, so I'm just going to use a X-Acto knife and carve out where the gill plates are. Nothing crazy, you don't have to do this. This is just a step I like to do. Okay, so for carving out the gill plate, I'm just going to use a small X-Acto knife. It definitely helps to have a fresh blade that's nice and sharp. And this is why I'd recommend using poplar, because it's a lot easier to carve with versus hardwoods. But all I'm going to do is just cut a semi-deep groove just right along our line right there. I'm going to make a couple passes to make sure it's deep enough. And don't push too hard, you're going to break your blade or hurt yourself. You'll figure it out. And then I'm just going to put the blade against the side of it and dig right into where that line is. I don't know how well this is going to show up on camera right now, but later when we go to paint it, we'll paint some red into where the gills are. We're cutting this out. But yeah, you can see it right there. Like, that's all I did, and that's simple enough. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of these. Alright, so there we have it on both sides, and I'm going to take some sandpaper to it and kind of clean that up a little bit. Now I'm going to start cleaning up this mouth, and one thing I always like to do is take my sandpaper and just run it over the edge. It's going to round off that corner and give it a real nice finished look to it. So there we go, just rounding over the corner of that mouth. Makes it look pretty nice from the side anyways. And I'm going to go ahead and take my sandpaper and start working on the inside and clean that up a little bit. I actually think I'm going to avoid using the Dremel tool. That way you guys can have the same results I have with this one in case you don't have a Dremel tool. I'll do another video on another time of a lot more detailed carving with the Dremel, but for this one, keeping it simple, straightforward, and yep. We are ready to drill our holes for our eyelets. And normally on the inside of the mouth where my Forstner bit was at, normally I would take the Dremel and clean that up, but that's just for aesthetics. It's not going to affect the way that the fishing lure is going to work. So we're going to go ahead and drill our holes and make our eyelets for it. And then one thing I should say also, so one thing that people do with topwater fishing lures is they'll drill a hole in the belly of it and add some weight to make sure when it hits the water that it's going to not float upside down. All the ones that I started off making and some of the poppers I'm still making now, the hooks have been enough for me that every time it hits the water it's going to roll right side up. But if you're having problems with that, depending on the shape of your fishing lure, I recommend adding some weight in the bottom. But for one this simple and it's a beginner's fishing lure, it's pretty straightforward. Hooks are going to be heavy enough to hold it at the bottom. So let's go ahead and drill these holes for the eyelets, and we'll make the eyelets as well. Alright, so all I'm going to do is move the camera so you guys can see better. Is just drill a hole in the butt, drill a hole in the front for our fishing line to connect to, and drill one just before the center line, so probably like right in here, about even where that last gill plate is. You want to make sure two things. One, your fishing lure is long enough that the middle hook and the back hook won't connect to each other, because that's super frustrating when that happens, like when you cast it. Or if it's really short, just use one hook, but I'm doing two on this one. Another thing that is helpful is if you have something to kind of give a little indentation for a starting point to drill your holes. I'm just going to wing this one and hopefully I get it centered enough. And the deeper you can go, the better. And make sure when you're drilling this hole in the center that your drill bit's not going to go all the way through it, because that really sucks whenever you spend a lot of time hand sanding one or if you had a lot more carving to it. So just be mindful of that whenever you're doing it. Boom, we are ready to make the eyelets. Alright, so for your wire you want to make sure it's not just bare metal because it'll rust and eventually fall apart. I believe galvanized is what you're looking for, and also you don't want to be using aluminum because aluminum isn't going to be strong enough. So all I'm doing It's cutting a piece of wire, and I've got this small, it was a nail I drove into the board and then grinded off the top head of the nail. I'm bending this around just to kind of get it a starting point, and then putting it into the drill. So you got something like that. And we're going to stick it over the wire. And there you have it. Homemade eyelet, and once we epoxy that into the fishing lure, it's not going to go nowhere. So again, like the longer you can make these, the better. It's just going to add more strength to it. I've never had one of these rip out on me. So there we have it, our 3 eyelets. I'm going to go ahead and dry fit them into our fishing lure, and then we're going to put some polyurethane on here to seal the wood. That way when we paint it, grain doesn't rise. And I'm also going to hit it with some finer sandpaper. I've got some 1000 grit here. So I'm just going to hand sand it with that, put our eyelets in, and then we'll dip it for to help seal the wood. So we're going to go ahead and epoxy our eyelets into the fishing lure. And I've got my big thing of epoxy here, of 2-part glue epoxy. But the wrapper came off that one. So I've got the smaller one. It's the Loctite epoxy. It's 2-part. And this one is a translucent yellow. It's an old one I had that's all dried up and messed up. I like the clear ones, especially if you're not going to even paint your fishing lure, you'd want clear instead of yellow. So we're going to go and do that. All you're going to do is put a little bit of both, make sure it's fairly well even. And this stuff does dry super fast, so I got to work pretty quick with it. And anything you got for a stir stick works. Just make sure it's mixed thoroughly. Alright, and all I'm going to do is lay this down inside that glue. And the more glue, the better. You want it to be bubbling back out. And what I like to do is dip it down in there, pull it back out, get a little bit more on there. And wipe up the excess. And for aesthetic purposes, make sure she's straight. Alrighty, so we're going to let that dry, and then we will get some polyurethane on there to help seal up the wood. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and seal the wood. That way whenever we paint, or one, first off, the wood's going to be sealed. That's kind of important. And then 2, when you go to paint, it's going to make your paint job look a little bit better. And I'm just using the polyurethane. It's a clear satin. Doesn't matter if it's clear or crystal clear or what. All you want to do is make sure that the wood is sealed. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this open, and we're going to do that. And what I'm going to do is just be using a paper clip, hooking the lure and dipping the whole thing down in there. I like to let it soak for just a second. Pull her back out. And make sure you dump everything out of the mouth, that way you don't have a giant puddle in there. Alright, so once it's pulled out, I'm just going to hang it up on my little drying rack to dry. Alright, sorry about that guys, the other camera I was using, the SD card got full, so I went and dumped that, and then I came back to finish filming, and then the battery died. I'm borrowing that camera from someone because it's got a lot better quality than this one does. But we'll finish up with this one, so we're almost done anyways. On the popper that we were carving, I don't know at what point it cut off, but we dipped it in the polyurethane to help seal the wood. That way our paint will be better and it helps protect the wood. So all that's left to do on this one is paint it. I'm going to be doing 2 different lure painting videos without an airbrush. So one of them is going to be painting it with acrylic paint, which is what we're going to do with this one, and the other video is going to be painting it with spray paint. So make sure to check both those out. I'm going to link them in the description below as soon as they are available. And as always, if you guys have any questions, please comment them below, and any suggestions to help make the videos better. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time with another video and another lure building or painting shenanigans, whatever they are. Peace!